Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here for this session. The session on water conservation and management in the Karnataka Smart Cities Investment Summit. Let me first thank Charulata and her colleagues for inviting me and thank my co-panelists for being here. Slight correction to what the compere said, I'm not in a particular hurry. I'm just sticking to the original schedule. So I'm sorry if I need to leave at about 4:15 because I have a prior commitment. What I'll try and do in the sort of opening remarks is to very briefly set the context and thereafter request each panelist to speak on his or her strength in terms of the issues that I identify or any other issue that they feel like for about 7-8 minutes. The big picture on water and sort of much more focused picture on private participation in water is, I think, the general theme that we should be focusing on. If you look at the big picture and if you look at the Indian data, if you see a 25-year period immediately post-liberalization, let's say 92-93, to about 17-18, a quarter century, India has reduced poverty by 3x. It's a 3x reduction of poverty measured by any standard measure of poverty. From 46%, we've come down to 13% of poor people in India. On an average, during this quarter century, we've also clocked reasonably good rates of growth. If you take the average, it's perhaps one of the fastest growing quarter centuries in the last 100 years or so. But as a recent World Bank publication points out very poignantly, the Indian growth story is thirsty. I repeat, the Indian growth story is thirsty. India is both hugely water stressed and water intense in its growth. And let me just give you a couple of examples of this. This audience perhaps knows all this data well, but I think it's useful to remember the context. One of the most water stressed countries in the world is the label that you will see whenever you look at Indian macro water data. If you look at the per capita water availability from around the same period, if you look at the period of about 25-30 years, it's come down by more than half, from something like 3,500 cubic meters per capita to a little less than half of that. The estimates on current numbers vary. The other known data in terms of global comparison, broadly 18 to 20% of world population with 4% of water resources. Now, clearly, these are all huge and clear indicators of us being a water-stressed country, but the paradox is we've also chosen a growth path which is extremely water-intensive. If you look at comparisons, for instance, each unit of water used for irrigation in China produces 5x. In other words, 5 times more GDP in agriculture per unit of water than India. Compare countries like Brazil and the US, the number is 3x, 3.5x. So our water efficiency, especially in irrigation, is absolutely scandalous. It's actually horrendous in terms of water utilization. And the high water losses in irrigation, water guzzling crops in water-stressed areas is a story that all of us are familiar with. And I think what is making life and going to make life even more difficult is climate change, which gets mentioned in the paper that has been circulated for today's session, rising temperatures, declining rainfall, extreme events, all of this will lead to much higher unpredictability of water availability and very complicated water resource management. And I think it's important to realize that the crisis is not somewhere out there in the future, it is right now. Highest water stress in areas with the highest population and highest economic activity, point one. And an estimated 600 million people, which is close to 50% of India, are in high to extreme water stress areas. Now, with this very, very discouraging, bleak background, what is the way forward? Essentially, we need to work on, I think, three broad sets of issues. Efficiency in overall water use. Number two, much greater focus on service delivery and correspondingly less focus on infrastructure provision, which is what typically Indian governments tend to focus on. Focus on service delivery rather than infrastructure delivery as in the past, and whole bunch of newer or renewal of institutions that handle the very, very difficult political economy of the water supply. Now, what is very perversely encouraging is the very high coping costs that individuals, and especially the poor, undertake to handle their own water requirements. So if you actually carry out, some people in KUIDFC may recall, in the years 2000 to 2005, we had conducted perhaps the largest willingness to pay survey for water in the outer, the 8 municipalities of Bangalore, which have now been collapsed into the city of Bangalore. And the finding was, forget the willingness to pay, people were paying enormously large sums of money as coping costs to meet with their requirements of water. As always, the difficulty is they are unwilling to pay the state, given the poor credibility of the state and the state institutions. So in this context, to make the most efficient use of water, bringing in private sector into an area which is fraught with politics, and therefore de-risking the private sector from challenges that the private sector cannot handle, and creating institutions that will bring about uncertainty, which will minimize uncertainty and bring about certainty for private investment is, I think, broadly the way forward. I will conclude my opening remarks here and call upon the compeer to call people in whichever sequence people would like to go. But I think ideally, if we can get a flavor of some of these issues, I think we'll move the debate forward. Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity.